Somewhere beyond the last map star, there is a station hanging in the dark. Aelith Cross. 12 levels. 43 species. 3,000 souls. Pull back far enough and it disappears entirely. A lit window in an empty house. Move closer now. Level 6. A formal chamber. Blue walls. 7 judges in a curved row. A man standing alone at the center. No lawyer, no prepared statement. Just a man who decided to tell the truth and is hoping that's enough. His hands are still. His jaw is set. He has the face of someone who has survived worse rooms than this. Closer. He opens his mouth to speak, and then a sound, small, impossible. A door, a hinge, footsteps, small ones, crossing a floor they were never supposed to reach. Every head turns. Part 1. The floor. Somewhere in the dark between stars there is a station. Aelith Cross. 12 levels. 43 species. 3,000 souls moving through corridors that smell like 6 different planets at once. Pull back far enough and it looks small. A lit window in an empty house. Move closer. Level 6. A formal chamber. Blue walls deep as ocean trenches. 7 judges arranged in a curve. A man standing alone at the center with no lawyer, no prepared statement, no plan except to tell the truth and hope that's enough. His hands are still. His jaw is set. He has the face of someone who has survived worse rooms than this. He opens his mouth to speak. And then a sound. Small. Impossible. A door. A hinge. Footsteps. Small ones. Crossing a floor they were never supposed to reach. Every head turns. 6 months earlier. The lab smelled like ozone and bad decisions. Kyle Marin had been awake for 19 hours. He knew this not because he'd checked the clock. He'd stopped checking clocks 4 years ago when checking clocks started feeling like counting down to something he couldn't name. He knew it because his second coffee had gone cold without him noticing. That was always the sign. 19 hours, maybe 20. The xenobiology samples weren't going to analyze themselves. He told himself that every night. Every night the samples sat in their trays patient as stone while he stared at data that blurred at the edges and told him things he already knew. Velrani genetic markers. Protein chains that folded in ways human biology had no language for. Beautiful. In the way that things are beautiful when you have no one to describe them to. Kyle was good at that. Finding beautiful things alone. He'd been practicing for 44 years, and he'd gotten very, very good at it. The station hummed around him. Aelith Cross, 12 levels of diplomatic offices, research wings, residential corridors, a food district that smelled like 6 planets simultaneously, 43 species, 3,000 residents, and Kale Marin, who knew the names of exactly 2 of them. Darrow Kelsch, his colleague, the only person who knocked on his lab door without being invited. And nobody else. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Not because Kale didn't know how to talk to people. He knew exactly how. He'd simply decided somewhere in the wreckage of his 39th year that knowing how was not the same as having to. That distance was a choice and not a failure. That a man could build a life out of work and silence and cold coffee and call it enough. He'd been calling it enough for 4 years. He pushed back from his workstation, rolled his neck until something cracked, decided that 20 hours was a reasonable place to stop. The corridor outside the science wing was empty at this hour, which was the point of this hour. He preferred the station at its quietest, when the diplomatic personnel were sleeping, when the visiting researchers had retreated to their quarters, when the only sounds were the mechanical breath of life support and his own footsteps on metal flooring. Boot on metal, boot on metal, boot on metal, a rhythm, reliable, not unlike a heartbeat, except a heartbeat could betray you. He was 3 corridors from his quarters when he remembered. He'd left his access card in the lab. Of course he had. Kale stopped walking, stared at the ceiling, counted to 4, turned around. The cargo bay pressure alarm went off at 14:32 station time. He remembered the exact moment because he'd been in the middle of centrifuging something delicate and the alarm made him jerk and he lost the sample. 6 hours of work, gone before he'd even processed what the sound meant. What it meant was Corridor 7C, a microfracture in the external seal, temporary, contained within 40 seconds, no actual danger. But protocol was protocol. Protocol said everyone evacuated to emergency shelter regardless of actual threat level. And so 3,000 people started moving at once. Cale moved toward the shelter like he was supposed to. He rounded the corner at Junction 9C and almost walked into a wall. Except it wasn't a wall. It was a child. She was pressed into the angle where two walls met as far back as she could get. Small. Even by Vilrani standards, she was small. Her species ran tall and slender. Long ears that could tilt 40 different directions. Skin that shifted between gray and blue and something closer to silver depending on the light. She couldn't have been more than 7. She was crying with her whole body. Not the kind of crying that asks for something. The kind that happens when a child has already decided no one is coming. The kind that doesn't reach outward. It just folds inward, smaller and smaller, until there's nothing left but the shaking. Cale stopped. He looked down the corridor. The shelter was 80 meters away. The alarm was still screaming. Everyone else was already moving heads down purposeful, following the protocol that he was currently violating by standing perfectly still in Junction 9C. He looked back at the child. She hadn't seen him yet. Too deep in the crying. Too far inside whatever terror had swallowed her. He should have grabbed a passing crew member. Should have flagged someone in authority. Should have kept moving and trusted the system to handle it the way systems were supposed to handle things. Instead, he sat down on the floor. Right there. On the cold metal floor of Junction 9C, in the middle of an emergency evacuation, back against the wall, knees up, voice very quiet. Hey, she startled. Eyes snapped to him, large, amber gold, wet, assessing him the way children assess, which is to say, completely honestly, without the social filters adults spend 30 years building up and another 30 years pretending they never needed. I've got you, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She stared at him for a long moment, deciding. Then she sat down on the floor next to him. They waited out the alarm together. He didn't ask her name. She didn't ask his. He told her she was brave. She said she wasn't. He said being scared and staying anyway was the whole definition of brave. Not the absence of fear. Never the absence of fear. Just the decision to stay inside it rather than run. She considered this with the gravity of a small person encountering a new idea and taking it seriously. 10 minutes later, a Vilrani woman came running around the corner. Tall, silver-white hair the color of pale winter branches, carrying the faintest trace of violet. Moving with the controlled urgency of someone who had been professionally calm for so long that panic looked like speed rather than fear. She stopped when she saw them. Both of them. On the floor. Cale stood, made sure the woman had the child securely, said, "She's okay, you made it, she was very brave." Then he went to the shelter. That was it. That was the whole thing. He didn't think about it afterward. Not much. There was the lost sample to mourn the incident report, to file the return to the rhythm of 19-hour days, and cold coffee and beautiful things observed alone. 3 months. He didn't think about it in 3 months. He was thinking about it now because someone was standing outside his quarters. Cale saw her from the end of the corridor and stopped walking. She was tall. Vilrani tall, which meant she had 4 inches on him. She stood with the particular stillness of someone who had trained themselves not to show how long they'd been waiting. Her ears were angled forward alert. Her hands were clasped in front of her knuckles, not quite white, but close. Her skin was silver white in the corridor's ambient light. Hair the color of pale winter branches, carrying the faintest trace of violet, pinned back in a style that said she'd dressed for this, for knocking on a stranger's door in the middle of the night cycle. Her eyes, when he was close enough to see them, were amber gold, the same amber gold as the child in the corridor. The resemblance once noticed was unmistakable. Same eyes, same quality of complete, honest assessment, the same way of looking at a person like they were something to be understood rather than managed. She was looking directly at him. Not through him, not past him, at him. Like she'd memorized a description and was confirming it against the original. Kale kept walking. Because what else do you do? Dr. Marin. Her translator rendered the formal address in clean accented standard. I am Counselor Solon Vale. I apologize for the hour. He recognized the title. Velrani Diplomatic Service. Senior level. The counselor prefix meant something specific about rank and clearance and the kind of person who didn't show up at strangers' doors without very good reason. It's fine, he said, because it was late and he was tired and he'd lost his access card. Is there something wrong? Yes. A pause, like she was deciding how much truth to lead with. My daughter has been crying for 3 days. She calls for you by name. Another pause. Or rather, she calls for the kind man, the human with the gentle voice. When I cross-referenced station personnel records with her description, I found you. Kale stared at her. Your daughter. Saya, she is 7 years old. He was quiet for a moment, running through possibilities, coming up empty on all of them. I don't. He stopped, started over. I'm not sure I understand how I'm connected to your daughter. 3 months ago, the cargo bay alarm. Oh. The memory arrived complete. The floor, the walls meeting at an angle, a small body pressed into a corner, the alarm still screaming, everyone else moving. I've got you. I'm not going anywhere. I remember, he said. Solon's ears moved, a subtle forward tilt. He couldn't interpret it yet. He would learn. She hasn't forgotten you, she said. Children don't forget the people who make them feel safe during terror. It imprints, neurologically. It becomes part of how they understand the world. She held his gaze, steady, careful. She hasn't eaten properly in 2 days. I have tried everything I know how to try. Something about the way she said that last part, the precision of it, like it had cost her to admit that her considerable resources had limits, that she was standing here at midnight in front of a stranger because she had run out of other options. And you're here because she needs to see you. Solon's voice didn't waver, but something underneath it did, just slightly, like a foundation that was solid but not unaware of the weight it was carrying. I don't enjoy asking strangers for help. I want to be clear about that. But my daughter needs you, and that makes everything else secondary. Kale looked at her, this woman who had dressed carefully for a midnight request and was standing very straight because the alternative was leaning on something and she didn't lean on things. He thought about a child on a floor. He thought about, I'm not going anywhere. Let me get my access card, he said. I left it in the lab. Her quarters were in the diplomatic wing. Level 8. Kale had never been to level 8. They walked in silence for most of it, which he didn't mind. He was used to silence. What he wasn't used to was silence that contained things. Weighted, specific. Someone else's grief taking up space in the air between two people, pressing gently against everything it touched. Solon walked with purpose, but her shoulders were carrying something. He could see it the way people who'd been holding things alone for a long time carried it. Not dramatic, not visible to anyone not paying attention. But there, a compression, a tightness just below the surface that never quite released even when everything above it looked perfectly composed. He wondered how long she'd been doing that. Then he decided that was none of his business. The Guardian's mark, she said suddenly. He glanced at her. It's what happened between you and Saya in the corridor. She kept walking, didn't look at him. In Velrani culture, when a person protects a child at cost to themselves, especially in a moment of danger, the child recognizes that person as their guardian. It's not legal. It's not adoption. But it is. She paused, choosing words like she was choosing between weights, aware that the wrong one would say too much or too little. Significant. Deeply significant. The bond it creates is real, neurologically, emotionally. For children of Saya's age, it is not metaphor. It is not sentiment. It is a genuine cognitive and emotional restructuring. Kale processed that. I didn't know, he said. I know you didn't. I was just... He stopped. The sentence had nowhere good to go. I was just doing what anyone would do. Except apparently not. Her voice was quiet. without accusation, just stating a fact she'd had 3 months to sit with. You stayed. When you could have kept walking, that's the whole of it. They had reached her door. She entered the code. The door slid open. She stepped aside to let him pass first, which he recognized as a gesture of trust towards someone she had every reason to be cautious of. He walked into warmth. The quarters were distinctly Velrani. Lower light levels than human spaces, preferred the illumination softer coming from embedded fixtures rather than overheads. Walls hung with geometric art in deep blues and silvers patterns he would later learn were family lineage markers. Furniture scaled for taller proportions. It smelled faintly of something floral and something mineral layered the way living spaces smell when they belong to people who have made them real over time, not just occupied them. In the center of the room, on the floor, not on the furniture, on the floor, sat a small Velrani child surrounded by paper drawings, dozens of them, spread in a radius around her like she'd been working outward from the center for hours. Her ears were flat against her head. She was the picture of a child who had given up on something and was waiting for confirmation that she was right to. Then she looked up. The change was total, immediate. Her ears shot forward, eyes went wide. Those amber eyes. He recognized them now in context in the light of a room that belonged to her. The same eyes that had assessed him in the corridor 3 months ago and decided in the space of a few seconds that he was safe. She said something. The translator caught it as you came back, and then she was on her feet. She crossed the room at a run. Small, 7 years old. She hit him like a wave, arms wrapped around his legs with a grip that surprised him in its strength. Velrani children were stronger than they looked, their slender frames built on a different structural logic than human bodies. Her whole body was trembling, not from cold, from relief. You came back. I was scared you forgot me. Kale went still for a moment. He was not historically a person who knew what to do with being held onto, with being someone's anchor, with being needed in the specific way that a child needed, which was total and uncomplicated, and left no room for the usual human hedging. Then he did what he'd done 3 months ago in the corridor. He sat down on the floor, right there, in the middle of her drawings, in the middle of her mother's diplomatically perfect living space. He sat down and brought himself to her level because it was the only thing that had seemed right the first time, and it still seemed right now. She immediately rearranged herself to sit next to him, pressed against his side, one small hand gripping his sleeve like he might dissolve if she eased up even slightly. I didn't forget you, he said. I've been here the whole time. I just didn't know you needed me. I needed you lots. She said it with the matter-of-factness of a 7-year-old reporting data, presenting evidence. I was sad and nobody understood except Mama. But words don't help when the sad is inside. Mama's words are good, but they go around the outside. Yeah, he said. I know what that's like. She looked up at him, studying, that same quality of complete honest assessment. You're my guardian. He glanced at Solon, who was standing in the doorway of the room, watching. Her composure perfectly assembled except for something around her eyes that wasn't quite composure. She gave the smallest nod. Yeah, he said. I am. That means you protect me and I can trust you forever. Right. Good. And just like that, the distress was gone. Not slowly, not in stages, all at once, like a switch that had been waiting for exactly this input. She leaned against him, and the words began, I have so many things to tell you. I made drawings, and I learned a new counting system that works in base 7, which is how we count. And I want to know about Earth because Mama says that's where you're from originally, and I've never seen a planet with real oceans, only pictures. And why do humans have such little hair compared to most mammals? Because I looked it up, and it seems inefficient from a temperature regulation standpoint. The words came out in a stream, uncontained. Weeks of backed-up questions and observations and half-formed theories finally finding somewhere to go. Finally finding someone to go to. Kale sat on the floor of a diplomat's living quarters at midnight and answered every single one. Solon made tea quietly in the adjacent kitchen, moving carefully, like she didn't want to interrupt something important, like she understood that what was happening in her living room was delicate, in the way that real things are delicate, not fragile but significant, and significance deserves space. She watched from the doorway as her daughter showed this human man the drawings she'd made over the past 3 months, pointing out details with small, focused fingers, explaining the significance of each color choice with the seriousness of someone presenting a doctoral thesis, informing him gravely that the one in the upper left was supposed to be him, but ears were hard to draw on humans because they barely had any, and what they did have was in the wrong place structurally. That is extremely accurate, Kale said. Saya beamed, the full beam, the one that took over her whole face and made her ears go completely vertical. Solon pressed her lips together, because something was happening to her composure, and she needed a moment with her back to the room and the sound of the kettle to hold it in place. 4 years since she'd lost Devon. 4 years of being the only person Saya ran toward. The only one Saya looked for in a room full of people. The only person her daughter trusted with the specific totality that children trusted before they learned that trust had limits. She had thought she'd made peace with that, with being enough, with the particular shape of a family that was 2 instead of 3. She had been wrong about what peace felt like. She brought the tea out, set it on the low table. Kale glanced up with the expression of someone who had forgotten tea was a thing that existed in the universe outside of his lab. Saya glanced up with the expression of someone who had genuinely not noticed the world continuing to function around her while she talked. "Mama," Saya said with great patience, "I'm telling him about the counting system. I can see that. It's important. Everything is important. Drink your water." Say made a face, the face of someone who found the interruption philosophically questionable, but lacked the energy to argue. She reached for the water glass, kept talking. 20 minutes later, Saya was asleep on the floor, still holding Kale's hand. She hadn't asked permission. She'd simply decided he was where she was sleeping and arranged herself accordingly with the absolute confidence of someone who had assessed the situation and reached an obvious conclusion. Kale looked at the sleeping child, then at his captured hand, then at Solon. "She does this," Solon said quietly. "She decides she trusts someone. There's no negotiation, no process. She just—" Solon looked at her daughter and something moved through her expression. Complex and quiet and too layered to name. "She just knows. She's never been wrong." Kale carefully extracted his hand from Saya's grip. The child stirred, made a small sound, didn't wake. He stood. Solon gestured toward the adjacent sitting area. 2 chairs, a viewport looking out at a field of stars. He followed her there and they sat for a moment in quiet. 2 people looking at stars, which is an activity that simplifies most things by reminding you of scale. "The Guardian's mark," Kale said. "You said it's significant. What does that mean practically?" Solon folded her hands. "It gives you rights and responsibilities." "Tell me the responsibilities first." She looked at him. The careful diplomat's face shifted. Not much, but enough. Like he'd said something she hadn't expected, had phrased the question in a direction she hadn't anticipated from someone in his position. "To honor her trust," she said. "To protect her if you're able. To not abandon her callously. Not vanish from her life without reason or warning. She's 7. She would experience it as betrayal, and betrayal at this age leaves marks." A pause. "And the rights to be present for significant moments. Her schooling, coming-of-age ceremonies. To speak on matters concerning her well-being if I'm unavailable. You have standing in our culture to advocate for her in ways that carry legal weight. I'm human. I don't know your culture. I know." Her ears tilted slightly forward. "I'll help you learn. Saya doesn't care about protocols or precedents. She cares that you're present, that you keep your word." The tilt shifted, became something a degree warmer. "You've already done the important parts correctly." Kale looked out at the stars. He thought about his quarters, functional, quiet, full of research and equipment and nothing that belonged to anyone else. He thought about 20-hour days and cold coffee and the specific quality of silence that a space station had at 3 in the morning when you were the only one awake and the only sound was life support breathing. He thought about how long it had been since he'd sat on a floor with someone. "I'd like to be involved," he said. Heard it come out of his mouth and recognized it as true, in the way that things were true when you said them before you'd finished deciding to. I don't know what that looks like. I've never done this before. Any of it. He looked at her. But I'd like to try. Solon was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of uncertainty, the silence of someone choosing the right words for something that mattered. Then we'll work it out together, she said. The three of us. From the other room, small and sleepy a voice. Is my guardian staying? Solon looked at Kale. The question in her eyes was real. She wasn't managing him. She was asking. Yeah, he called back. I'm staying. A pause, then satisfied the voice of someone whose hypothesis had been confirmed. Can he stay forever? Solon raised an eyebrow. Kale thought about forever. About what it would mean to matter to someone. To have a place to be that wasn't a lab at midnight with cold coffee and data that blurred at the edges, and no one to tell about the beautiful things. We'll see, he said to Solon, quiet enough that only she could hear. Solon understood. She nodded. And for the first time in what felt like a long time, something in Kale Marin's chest did something that wasn't nothing. 5 weeks passed. He didn't plan it. That was the thing he kept returning to in the rare moments he had time to actually think about it rather than just live it. He hadn't made a decision to become a regular presence in their lives. There was no morning when he sat down and weighed the options and concluded that showing up was the right choice. He just kept showing up, and no one asked him to stop. Somewhere in the second week, it had stopped feeling like a visit and started feeling like something he didn't have a word for yet. Not home. That was too large a word, too loaded with implications he wasn't ready to examine. A direction. Something closer to a direction. The difference between facing a wall and facing a window. He arrived on Tuesdays with data pads full of Earth geography, satellite imagery, ocean depth maps, coastline surveys, geological formations. Saya studied them with the intensity of a doctoral student who suspected her advisor was withholding the really interesting data. She had opinions, strong, specific, well-reasoned opinions. The Pacific Ocean, she informed him on their third Tuesday, was unreasonably large, and someone should look into whether it had always been that size or whether something had gone wrong. He arrived on Thursdays because Saya's schoolwork involved human biology and the materials she had access to were outdated, and he had better ones, and it seemed wasteful not to share them. He arrived on Saturdays because Saya had asked him to help with Base 7 arithmetic, and he'd been working on an approach that might actually make conceptual sense to a 7-year-old who thought in Vellani patterns rather than human ones. He didn't arrive on other days, except sometimes he did. Darrow Kelsch noticed. Of course Darrow noticed. Darrow noticed everything, which was both his greatest quality and his most irritating one. And the combination was something Kale had learned to navigate by simply accepting that there would always be things Darrow knew before Kale was ready to discuss them. You're different, Darrow said one morning, appearing in the lab doorway with 2 coffees and the expression of someone who had been composing an observation for several days and had finally decided it was ready. I'm working, Kale said. Darrow searched for the word with the focus of someone who knew the right one existed and refused to settle for an approximation. Landed on present, you're actually present. I'm always here. No. Darrow set a coffee on the workstation. Deliberate, like he was placing a marker. You've been here physically for 4 years, in this lab, in this corridor, on this station, but lately you're actually... He wiggled a hand in a way that somehow communicated exactly what he meant. In the room. The actual room that the rest of us are also in. Kale looked at the coffee. There's a child, he said, because there was no point hiding it. Because Darrow would find out anyway, because Darrow always found out anyway. And because saying it out loud to another person made it somehow more real and less frightening at the same time. And her mother, I seemed to be their guardian. Darrow was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was for Darrow a notable pause. The Vellani diplomat on level 8, you know her? I know of her. Everyone in the science wing knows of her. She submitted a formal inquiry about xenobiology research practices 7 months ago that was extremely thorough and mildly alarming in its specificity. Darrow sat on the edge of the workbench with the ease of someone who had been sitting on that exact spot for 4 years. How did you end up as her daughter's guardian? I sat on a floor. Darrow blinked. During the cargo bay alarm 3 months ago, there was a child alone in the corridor. Cale picked up his coffee. I sat with her until her mother found us. He paused. Apparently that's significant. Culturally. Apparently, Darrow said very carefully, as if he was calibrating his reaction to avoid saying the wrong thing. It is. A pause. How do you feel about it? Kyle thought about Tuesday evenings, about ocean depth maps spread across a low table, about a small hand gripping his sleeve in sleep, about standing in a kitchen doorway watching a child explain the structural inadequacies of human ear placement to a man who was listening like it was the most important information he'd ever received. Like I didn't expect it, he said, and like I don't want to give it back. It was a Tuesday evening when the notification arrived. Saya was absorbed in a holographic Earth map, dragging continents around with focused intensity and explaining to no one in particular that the Pacific Ocean was not just unreasonably large, but actively suspicious in its dimensions, and someone in authority needed to be informed. Solon was in the kitchen making something that smelled like cinnamon, and something else. Cale didn't have a name for something that was probably a Valrani spice with no standard equivalent. She had stopped apologizing for feeding him weeks ago, which he had taken as a sign of something, though he wasn't sure of precisely what. He was at the table, reading a Valrani text on cultural bonding practices that Solon had suggested, and that he was working through with a translation app and more sustained concentration than he usually brought to anything that wasn't directly related to his research. The grammar was irregular in ways that resisted systematic analysis. He was starting to think the language had been designed by someone who found regularity philosophically suspect. It was quiet, warm, ordinary in the way that extraordinary things eventually become ordinary if you let them stay long enough. Then the notification arrived. Solon's communicator chimed. She came out of the kitchen, read it, and something happened to her face. Not much. She was very good at not much. But Cale had been paying attention for 5 weeks and he saw it. Her ears pulled back, her hands stilled on the communicator, a stillness that was different from her usual composure. This one had something underneath it. He set down the text. What is it? She held out the communicator. He read it. The header was from the Office of Cultural Integrity, Valrani Diplomatic Council. The subject line used formal terminology he needed the translation app to parse, but the content was clear enough once the language resolved. Director Veth Oren had submitted a formal petition. He was requesting a tribunal. The grounds the Guardians marked between Saya Vael and Dr. Cale Marin was culturally invalid. A human could not hold guardian status over a child of diplomatic lineage. The bond in his formal assessment was an emotional response misidentified as a cultural one. A well-meaning gesture mistaken for a binding commitment. A category error, however, sincerely made. The tribunal would occur in 60 days. If the petition succeeded, the bond would be officially dissolved. Cale read it twice, set the communicator on the table. Who is Oren, director of the Cultural Integrity Committee? Solon's voice was even. Carefully even in the way that careful evenness was its own kind of signal. He has authority over questions of cultural practice and validity. She paused. His petitions are rarely unsuccessful. Why is he doing this? Solon was quiet for a moment. She sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, the gesture of someone organizing their thoughts into the order they needed to be in. And she told him. Veth Oren had a son, 8 years old the previous year. A respiratory emergency while traveling through a transit station operated by Terran medical personnel. The medical team had made the call to prioritize other patients. A resource decision, not a clinical error, but a decision that had left the boy waiting longer than was safe. He'd survived, but there had been damage. Lasting damage to his pulmonary function. A thing that would follow him for the rest of his life. Oren had filed complaints, had pursued every channel available, had received apologies and policy reviews and committee investigations, and nothing that resembled justice. Nothing that resembled what he actually wanted, which was not accountability. Not even change, though he would have accepted change. What he wanted was for it not to have happened at all, and that was the one thing no committee could give him. He doesn't know me, Kale said. No, and I had nothing to do with what happened to his son. No, Solon said again, but you are a human man with a scientific background who is now recognized as guardian to a Velrani child of diplomatic lineage. You are, she chose the word carefully testing its weight before she committed to it, the embodiment of something he cannot accept. Not you specifically, what you represent. The possibility that a human could hold that kind of trust from a Velrani child. Kale sat with that. Across the room, Saya had fallen asleep on the floor, with the Earth map still rotating slowly above her, casting blue light across her face. The Pacific Ocean revolving in slow holographic silence, unreasonably large and absolutely indifferent to the conversation happening 3 meters away. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Solon. What happens to her if the bond is dissolved? Solon's composure held, just barely, like something that was solid but aware of the pressure. For children, Saya's age, a forcibly severed guardian bond doesn't... She stopped, chose a different path through the sentence. She would recover eventually. Children are resilient, but the neurological and emotional impact is... Another stop. A breath. She has already lost her father. She does not need to learn that people who promise to stay also leave. She does not need that to be the lesson her childhood teaches her. The room was very quiet. Kyle looked at the notification on the table, read it a third time. 60 days. He thought about a child who had been crying for 3 days because she believed her guardian had forgotten her. He thought about sitting on the floor in an emergency evacuation and how obvious that choice had seemed. He thought about all the things that had seemed obvious to him that other people called mistakes. "Tell me what I need to do," he said. Solon looked at him. "It will be complicated," she said. "Oren has resources and influence and a success rate that—" "Tell me what I need to do," he said again. A pause. Her ears moved. That forward tilt, the one he was learning to read as something opening rather than closing, something that wasn't quite hope but was in the same family. "Tomorrow," she said. "We'll start tomorrow. Tonight." She glanced at Saya at the blue light of the rotating Earth on her daughter's sleeping face. "Let her sleep." He nodded. He didn't leave immediately. He sat at the table a while longer, with the notification and the rotating Earth map and the sound of Solon moving quietly in the kitchen, as if this was normal, as if this was just an evening with people who mattered to him. Which he realized somewhere between the 60-day deadline and the unreasonably large Pacific Ocean. It had become. He picked up the Velrani text, found his place, kept reading. Outside the viewport, the stars moved the way they always did. Patient, indifferent to human schedules and Velrani politics, and the 60-day countdown now running in the background of everything. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when you have begun without quite noticing it to share them. Part 2. The cost. The thing about building something good is that you don't notice you're doing it. Not while it's happening. You just show up. Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. You answer questions about ocean depth and base 7 arithmetic and why humans evolved without tails, which is a legitimate question that Ko found himself researching at 2 in the morning, because Saya had asked and he hadn't had a satisfying answer, and apparently that mattered to him now in a way it wouldn't have 6 weeks ago. He was researching tail evolution at 2 in the morning for a 7-year-old who was not technically his, except she was. That was the part he was still getting used to, not the fact of it. The fact of it had arrived quietly and settled in without much announcement. It was the weight of it he was still calibrating, the way it changed the texture of decisions, the way he found himself thinking when he was in the middle of something else entirely about what Saya would think of it, or what it would look like through those amber eyes. 5 weeks in Kale's life had rearranged itself around 2 gravitational centers he hadn't planned for. A child who treated his presence as a fact of nature, as settled and reliable as the station's life support cycling. And a woman who watched him from doorways with amber eyes and said very little and meant a great deal and had somewhere in the past few weeks become someone he thought about when she wasn't in the room. He noticed things about Solon the way you notice things when you were trying not to. The way she made tea like it was a task that deserved full attention not a thing to do while doing something else. The way her ears moved when she was thinking hard, a slow backward tilt, almost imperceptible, unless you knew to look for it. The way she laughed, which was rare enough to be significant every time it happened. Low and quiet, like she'd forgotten for a second to be careful, and then remembered too late and decided it was worth it anyway. He noticed, and then he went home to his lab and his cold coffee and told himself it wasn't relevant. Very convincingly, every single night. The 60-day countdown was a constant presence. Not loud, just there. The way a bruise was there. Not demanding attention until you pressed on it, but always present at the edge of awareness, coloring everything around it. Solon had connected him with a Velrani cultural liaison, a precise woman named Adrian Cavell, who communicated entirely in formal register and had approximately zero tolerance for approximation or vague language of any kind. She sent documents, long ones. Cale read every page. He learned about guardian bonds, their history going back 600 years of Velrani recorded practice, their cultural weight, the way they were treated not as legal constructs, but as moral facts, the ceremonies that formally recognized them, the obligations they created, the protections they afforded. He learned about the Tribune of Cultural Integrity, 7 members appointed by the Velrani Diplomatic Council, chaired by Oren, empowered to rule on questions of cultural validity and practice. He learned that Oren's petitions had a success rate of 83% across a career spanning 20 years. He didn't mention that statistic to Solon. She already knew it anyway. What he did mention one Thursday evening, while Saya was occupied with a holographic plant biology simulation and both adults were pretending to read at opposite ends of the table. Tell me about the other 17%. Solon looked up from her documents. The cases Oren lost, he said. What made them different from the ones he won? A pause, her ears tilted back. The thinking tilt. He'd learned to read it as the sign that she was actually considering rather than just selecting a preformed answer. In each case, she said slowly, the tribunal was persuaded that the bond itself was the evidence, not arguments about the guardian's fitness, not cultural precedent or technical compliance, just another pause, the same quality of careful selection, the reality of the relationship, what it had produced, who the child had become in its presence. The tribunal looked at the child and saw something that couldn't have come from nothing. Kael looked at Saya, who was currently explaining to the holographic fern that it was performing photosynthesis in a way that was technically correct, but showed a lack of ambition. Okay, he said, that's what we give them. Solon looked at him for a long moment, and then she did the thing she sometimes did, the rare thing, where the careful diplomat's face went briefly quietly open, where the composure didn't drop so much as become temporarily transparent. Okay, she said. Day 35 arrived like weather. Cale was in his lab earlier than usual, which was saying something given his baseline. The centrifuge was running. The coffee was hot for once. Darrow hadn't arrived yet, which meant the lab had exactly the kind of silence Cale had built his life inside. The kind that felt, some mornings, like an old friend. And other mornings, since approximately 5 weeks ago, like something he was starting to grow out of. His communicator buzzed. A public broadcast. Diplomatic Council. Official channel. Flagged urgent. He read it once, then again. Then he set it down very carefully on the workstation and looked at the centrifuge and counted the rotations for a while. Because the centrifuge kept spinning at exactly the rate it was supposed to. Consistent. Predictable. Operating precisely within its design parameters. Right now, that was the only thing in his immediate environment about which that could be said. Director Veth Oren had released a statement, addressed to the diplomatic community, framed as a matter of cultural integrity and public record. In it, Oren outlined his petition, its grounds, the guardian's mark in question, the human guardian, the questions of cross-species validity, and then attached formally as supporting evidence Cale's military record. All of it. The deployment, the night of the emergency extraction in deteriorating conditions, the order he'd received, the order he hadn't followed, the 2 soldiers who had died because his choice had compromised the unit's position, the inquiry, the formal review, the discharge, every word of it publicly available now to anyone in the Velrani diplomatic community who wanted to read it. Which was everyone, which was the point. Kyle read the attached summary a third time, then a fourth. The language was precise, formal, devastating in the specific way that formal language could be devastating when it described the worst night of your life in the passive voice, when it turned something you'd lived through into a series of bureaucratic observations. The officer's decision to deviate from extraction protocol resulted in positional compromise. 2 fatalities followed. The officer was subsequently separated from service. Separated from service. That's what they called it. He hadn't slept the night it happened. He hadn't really slept properly for 6 weeks afterward. He'd replayed every decision, every second of that extraction. The weight of the men he'd refused to leave behind, their faces, their names, their families that he knew about, because he'd served with them long enough to know those things. And the weight of the men who died because of where he was when he decided to stay. He'd never, not once, not in 5 years, arrived at a version of events where he could have done differently and still been the person he needed to be. But he'd also never found a version where 2 people were still alive. That was the part that didn't resolve. That was the part you carried. That was the part Oren had just handed to the entire diplomatic community to read over their morning tea, framed as evidence of a pattern of dangerous judgment. The lab door opened. Darrow walked in with 2 coffees, stopped in the doorway, read the room with the efficiency of someone who'd been reading Kale for 4 years. Set both coffees down. "I saw it," he said. "Good morning, Darrow. The centrifuge should finish in 4 minutes." "Yes." "Then I need to, Kale." Darrow sat on the edge of the workbench. Not the professional perch of someone making a point. The actual sit of someone settling in. "Talk to me." The centrifuge spun. Kale watched it. "I left 2 men behind," he said finally. "Except I didn't. That was the whole point. I refused the order to leave them. I stayed and tried to get them out. And the unit's position was compromised. And—" He stopped. The sentence went somewhere he'd been trying not to go all morning. 2 other men died. Because of where I was. Because of the choice I made to stay with the first 2. Darrow was quiet, the particular quiet of someone who understood that the wrong word would break something that was being carefully held. "I've never said that out loud before," Kale said. "Not exactly like that." "I know it, How do you know?" "Because you don't talk about it." Darrow picked up his coffee, held it without drinking it. "And you don't talk about it exactly the way you don't talk about things that are too heavy to carry into a room. The ones you leave outside. Every room. Every time." A long silence. "Were they wrong to discharge you?" Kale was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the centrifuge finished its cycle and the lab went to a different kind of quiet. "I followed my conscience," he said, "and people died. I'm still not sure if that means I was wrong. I'm just sure it means I carry it, and that the carrying doesn't stop because the question doesn't resolve." Darrow nodded slowly. "And now Oren's made it public. As evidence that I'm not fit." Kale finally reached for his own coffee. "That I can't be trusted with a child because I once couldn't follow an order that asked me to leave people behind." The irony of it sat between them. Too precise to be comfortable, too specific to be accidental. "What are you going to do?" Kyle thought about Saya, about the way she said his name like it was a word that had always existed and she'd just been waiting to use it. About the floor of Corridor 9C and a small body pressing into a corner, and a choice that had also seemed obvious. About how many times in his life the obvious choice had cost him something. About whether that pattern was a flaw or a feature. "The same thing I always do," he said. "Show up." He went to them that evening. Not Tuesday, not Thursday, just an evening when he couldn't not go, when the distance between his lab and their quarters felt like something imposed rather than chosen. Solon opened the door before he knocked. She'd been watching the corridor. He understood immediately that she'd been watching for a while. "You saw it," he said. "Hours ago." He walked in. Say was at the table drawing and her face lit up when she saw him. That immediate total brightness that still caught him off guard every time, even now, even today, when everything else felt like it was edged in something difficult. The brightness was unqualified. It didn't know about difficult. "You're early," she announced. I'm doing a drawing of the Aelith Cross Food District from memory. The Velrani section is accurate, but I'm struggling with the human section because it has too many right angles. Why do humans find right angles reassuring? We do, Kale agreed, sitting beside her. It's strange. Very strange, she confirmed with the satisfaction of someone whose hypothesis has been validated. Solon stood near the kitchen doorway, watching them, her ears doing the slow backward tilt, the thinking tilt, while her eyes did something more complex that Kale was only beginning to have the vocabulary to read. When Saya had been redirected to the architecturally correct number of angles in the food district, Solon made a quiet motion toward the adjacent room. He followed. She closed the door halfway, leaned against the wall, arms crossed. He'd learned that about her. When Solon crossed her arms, she was holding herself together, not keeping people out. "How are you?" she asked. "I'm fine." "Don't." A pause. The word landed with enough weight to require a moment before responding to it. "I've carried it for 5 years," he said. "It's not new weight. It's just," he searched for the right word, "public now. People are reading it and deciding what it means about me. That part is new." Some of the reaction has been, "I know." He'd seen it. Comments in the station's public forum. Colleagues who had nodded at him that morning with a different quality in the nod. Not hostile, just recalibrated, reconsidering the version of him they'd been carrying around, updating it with new information. "Does it change anything?" she asked. He looked at her directly. "For the tribunal, for you, for this." She gestured at the door at the sound of Saya narrating her drawing to herself in the other room, a steady, quiet monologue about right angles and their philosophical implications. "Does it change what you want?" He thought about it. Actually thought about it, gave the question the weight it deserved because she deserved an actual answer and not a reflexive reassurance. "No," he said. She exhaled, something she'd been holding carefully for hours. "Good," she said, quiet, "then because I need to tell you something." He waited. Her ears flattened slightly. The tell he'd learned. The one that meant she was about to say something that had cost her something to decide to say. "I knew," she said, "before I knocked on your door. I knew about your military record." The room was very still. "I'm a diplomat," she continued. "I don't approach strangers without information. When Saya described you and I identified you from station records, I ran a background inquiry, standard procedure, thorough by default." A pause. "I read everything. The deployment, the extraction, the discharge, all of it." Kale said nothing. "Let the information settle. I want you to understand, you investigated me." "Yes?" "And then you knocked on my door anyway." "Yes." He looked at her. This woman who held herself together by will and precision in a thorough reading of available data. Who had shown up at his door at midnight with her composure carefully assembled and her knuckles almost white and her daughter's name ready to explain everything. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because Oren made it public, and now you're going to hear people interpret it, decide what it means. And I needed you to know that I interpreted it first, before any of this." She met his eyes steady and direct. "And I still knocked on your door." The words landed. He felt them land, felt the specific weight of them, the precision of what she was actually saying. "What did you conclude," he asked, "when you read it? That you made a decision that cost you everything, and you'd make it again." Her voice didn't waver. "That you are precisely the kind of person I wanted near my daughter, not despite your record, because of what your record revealed about how you make decisions when it matters." A beat. That I was right. Kyle stood in her halfway open room and felt something redistribute in his chest. Something that had been positioned defensively for a very long time settling into a different configuration. "You could have told me," he said. "From the beginning." "Yes." She didn't look away. "I should have. That's what I'm apologizing for. Not the investigation. The silence after. You deserve to know that I had looked and still come." He let it sit between them. The apology, the explanation, the fact that she'd read the worst night of his life and walked toward him anyway. The fact that her assessment of him had been formed not in ignorance of his failures but in full knowledge of them. I read everything about you, she said quieter now, and I still knocked on your door. A pause. What does that tell you, Ko? A long moment. That you have terrible judgment, he said. And Solon Vale, careful, composed, controlled, laughed, low and quiet, like she'd forgotten to be careful and found when she forgot that she didn't miss it. He stored that sound somewhere specific in his memory, somewhere he'd be able to find it later when he needed it. Day 50 arrived, and with it the letter from the Cultural Integrity Office. Formal, stamped, delivered to both Solon's communicator and Kale's simultaneously, which was a deliberate procedural choice. Oren wanted them to read it at the same time from different locations without the chance to process it together first. To absorb it separately, react separately, come to whatever conversation followed, having already been through it alone. The letter informed them that in the interest of protecting the minor child's well-being during the pending tribunal, the Belrani Cultural Integrity Committee had authorized temporary relocation of Sayavel to a certified Belrani cultural residence facility on the station's 7th level, effective in 48 hours. The language was careful, compassionate even, clearly drafted by someone who understood how to use consideration as a strategy. The facility was described as nurturing, educational, staffed by qualified Velrani educators, appropriate in every measurable way for a child of Saya's age and cultural background. What it was away from Kayol, completely, legally, with documentation that would hold in any diplomatic review. Kayel read it in his lab, read it twice, walked to the viewport and looked out at the stars for a while long enough to let the initial reaction pass through without making any decisions inside it. Standard procedure, which meant Oren had done this before, had a process for it, had used this exact mechanism to create legal distance between a child and the person she'd bonded with, then argued before the tribunal that the bond was less essential than it appeared. Because look, the child is managing without the guardian present. The bond, while real, is not as constitutive as claimed. It had been exaggerated by emotional proximity. He understood the play. He put on his jacket and went to Solon. She was already on a call when he arrived. He could hear the clipped formal cadence of a professional conversation through the door before she opened it. She ended it when she saw him with the tone of someone filing a problem in a mental folder labeled for later. You read it, he said. I've been reading it for 2 hours, running scenarios. Can she fight it? Not without damaging her position at the tribunal. Solon moved back into the room, every motion precise. If I formally contest the relocation, Oren's team will argue that I'm prioritizing my personal preferences over Saya's cultural well-being, that I'm placing attachment above appropriate protective procedure. Her voice stayed even with the effort of someone who trained it to stay even. It makes us look like exactly what he's framing us as, an attachment that overrides rational judgment. So we can't fight it directly. Not directly. But you have a plan. She glanced at him. I have the beginning of one. Tell me. She did. It wasn't simple. It involved documentation and testimony and character witnesses Kale didn't yet have and would need to build relationships with in the next 10 days. It involved Solon navigating internal Velrani diplomatic politics with the kind of precision that made him aware again of how much she was managing at once, how many fronts this was being fought on simultaneously, how much of it she was carrying in ways he could see only partially. When she finished, he said, "What do you need from me? Be present. Exactly what you've been doing." That's not enough. It is. She was firm in the way she was firm when she was certain. The tribunal will assess the bond by its evidence. The evidence is what you've built with Saya over 5 months. Don't let Oren's strategy make you perform something different from what you've been doing. Her eyes found his, direct. He wants you defensive, reactive, demonstrating fitness rather than simply being it. Don't give him that. Kyle thought about that, the distinction between performing and being. The way those two things could look identical from the outside and feel completely different from the inside. And Saya, he said, when they take her to the facility. Solon's composure flickered, just once, like something underneath it shifted under sudden weight. She won't understand, not fully. I'll explain as much as I can. A pause. She'll be frightened, and then she'll be sad, And then she'll be waiting the way she was waiting before you came back, in the corner of herself. I know. There's nothing. I know. He said it gently, not dismissively. I'm not going to promise I can stop that. He stopped, found the actual shape of what he wanted to say. I want her to know I'm still there, even if I can't go in, even if I can only be outside. Solon looked at him for a long moment. She'll know, she said, and meant it. 48 hours later, Cale stood in the corridor outside the 7th level cultural residence facility. He'd been there for 20 minutes. He would be there until he had to leave, and then he'd come back tomorrow, and the day after, for however many days it took. The facility was genuinely well appointed. He'd reviewed the documentation Solon had been sent, and it was appropriate in all the ways that could be measured. Proper staffing ratios, culturally accurate environment, the right light levels, the right spatial proportions. Educational programs designed for Saya's age group by people who understood Velrani child development. It was not where Saya wanted to be. He knew this because through the secured viewport, a small rectangular window at corridor height that was presumably there for safety monitoring. He'd seen her face when they brought her in. Watched her look toward the door. Watched her search. She hadn't seen him yet through the glass. He stayed anyway, because staying was the whole thing. Day 53. The message came through at 4 in the morning. Saya had developed a fever. Not serious, not medically concerning. Common in Velrani children during periods of significant emotional stress, the facility's medical staff had noted. The body expressing what the mind was processing. Staff had notified Solon per protocol. Solon had notified Cale because she knew he'd want to know. He was in his quarters when he read it. Still wearing the clothes he'd fallen asleep in, which meant he hadn't so much fallen asleep as stopped moving for a few hours until consciousness resumed on its own. He was at the facility by 4:17. The night attendant looked at him through the entry panel, looked at his credentials, looked back at him with the expression of someone who understood the situation and was deciding what kind of person they wanted to be in it. You can't come in, Dr. Marin. I know. Visiting hours don't begin until... I know. He kept his voice level. I'm not asking to come in. I just need to be close. The attendant studied him for a moment, then said nothing, which was the most generous possible response. Cale found the viewport, the small rectangular window at corridor height. He stood in front of it and looked through. The room beyond was dim, Velrani standard lighting low and blue. Saya was in a sleeping alcove near the far wall, small under the blankets, one ear visible above the fabric edge. Her face was flushed even in the low light, even through the glass. He could see it. She was awake. He didn't know how long she'd been awake, but she was. And then she turned her head and saw him. The change in her face was immediate, like a window with a light behind it suddenly illuminated. She sat up, crossed the room in small, careful steps, moving slowly because she was feverish and the floor was cold, pressed her palm flat against the interior surface of the glass. He pressed his against the exterior. The glass was cold and clear and completely insurmountable. And he pressed his hand against it anyway because it was the only way to close the distance between them, even partially. She smiled. Because she was 7, because she had already decided that her guardian being on the other side of a window was enough, that the presence counted even when the presence was separated by material he couldn't cross. He stood there, his hand against the glass, her hand against the glass, the thickness of the panel between them, the few centimeters that might as well have been the space between stars, and also somehow weren't because they could see each other, because she was smiling and he was there. He didn't move, not when his shoulder began to ache, not when the corridor lights cycled through their automated sequence, not when the night attendant walked past and looked carefully at the wall rather than at him, which was a courtesy he noted and would remember. He stood until Saya fell back asleep. Then he stayed a while longer, because that was the point. Because sometimes the point was simply not leaving. The next morning, Darrow was already in the lab when Cale arrived, surrounded by the specific energy of a person who had found something and was managing the controlled urgency of not saying it until the right moment. Sit down, Darrow said. I'll stand. Cale, Darrow turned the screen toward him. Sit down. He sat. The screen showed financial disclosure documents. Velrani public record, filed archived, technically accessible to anyone who knew where to look and was willing to dig through the bureaucratic layers designed to make the looking difficult without technically making it impossible. Director Veth Oren. Listed interests. Institutional affiliations, including one Cale didn't recognize at all. Darrow pulled up a second document, the unfamiliar affiliation connected to a transit infrastructure contract. Large, multi-species, multi-station. The kind of contract whose value had several digits in it. Currently under diplomatic review. Required formal sign-off from the Velrani Diplomatic Council's Foreign Relations Office. Solon's office. Solon's new appointment. The one that gave her direct oversight of whether that contract proceeded or stalled. Kyle stared at the screen and let the timeline assemble itself. When was this filed? The affiliation. 11 months ago. Darrow leaned back. The contract review was assigned to Solon's office 8 months ago. Before she came to the station? Yes. Before the tribunal petition? Yes. Darrow's voice was careful with the precision of someone who understood what they were saying. The petition was filed 3 months after the contract review assignment was confirmed. Kyle was very still. He looked at the documents, traced the connections. A man could be genuinely wounded and also strategic about where he directed that wound. A man could believe entirely in his cause and also choose his targets with an eye toward additional benefit. These things were not mutually exclusive. People were not simple. He's not just protecting Velrani tradition, Cale said slowly. He's also protecting a contract worth... Darrow turned the screen. The number was large enough to reframe several things at once. If Solon's appointment to Earth is delayed or revoked, Cale said someone else reviews the contract. Someone without her reputation. Someone who doesn't have a reputation for being exceptionally thorough and mildly alarming to people who'd prefer less thoroughness. Darrow pointed at him. My words from months ago. I remembered them for a reason. Kyle sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling of his lab, which was the same ceiling it had always been. Familiar. Unimpressive. He'd spent a lot of time looking at it. He thought about Oren, about a father who had watched his son be turned away by a system that should have helped him. Who had built that grief into something institutional? Who might have started with genuine principle and arrived over time at convenient principle? Who might have found that the two had become indistinguishable in his own mind, which was perhaps the most human thing about him? This changes things, he said. It complicates things, Darrow corrected, which is different and matters. Does Solon know? I found it 40 minutes ago. You're the first person I called. Cale stood, picked up his jacket, thought for a moment about how to use information carefully versus how to use it effectively and whether those were the same thing. I need to think about this, he said. I know you do. Darrow paused. But Cale, he stopped at the door. You're not in this alone. Darrow said it simply. The way Darrow said things he meant completely. No performance, no inflation, just the truth offered plainly and left there. Whatever you're building with them, you have people. Don't forget that. Cale looked at him. Darrow Kelsch, who had shown up every morning for 4 years with 2 coffees and no requirement that Cale explain himself or perform gratitude or be anything other than what he was. Who had found a thread in the middle of the night and pulled it because he understood what was at stake without being told. Thank you, he said, and meant it in all the dimensions it was possible to mean something. That night after he told Solon everything, after the careful silence she maintained while he laid out the documents in the timeline, after the precise questions she asked each one, moving the analysis forward rather than sideways, working through the implications the way someone worked through a problem they'd been trained their whole career to solve. After the moment when she stood at the viewport and looked out at the stars and said nothing for a full 2 minutes, he let her. She said, I suspected something like this. Not the specifics, but I suspected there was more than principle operating here, more than grief. Does knowing help? She turned from the viewport, the stars still moving behind her. It helps me understand the shape of the thing I'm dealing with. That's useful. Her eyes found his. But Kale, I want you to hear me say this. He waited. Whatever we find, however this develops. A pause. I don't want to win because his motives were impure. I don't want to stand in front of that tribunal and win on a technicality or a revelation about his finances. I know. I want to win because the bond is real. Because they look at her and they see what 5 months has done. Who she's become in those 5 months. She held his gaze. That's the only victory that matters. He understood the difference between tearing something down and building something up. Between winning on what the other person did wrong and winning on what you did right. Between the defensive and the affirmative. We do both, he said. We present what Darrow found because it's relevant and they should know it. And we show them who she is now. Those aren't in conflict. Solon looked at him for a long moment. Her ears tilted. Not the backward-thinking tilt. Not the forward alert tilt. Something else. Something warmer and more particular that he was only beginning to have the vocabulary for. No, she agreed. They're not. Later. Much later, after Solon had gone to her room and the station had settled into its 3 in the morning quiet, Kale sat at the table alone. The financial documents spread across the screen. The rotating Earth map Saya had left open the Pacific Ocean, still turning in slow holographic silence, unreasonably large, waiting to be confirmed in person. The Velrani text on cultural bonding practices dog-eared to the chapter on guardian rights. He thought about the Terran Research Institute, about the message he'd sent 3 weeks ago, before the tribunal, before the facility, before the curfew glass, in the cold window, and Saya's hand pressed against the other side of it. He'd sent that message before he knew any of this would cost him anything. He'd decided to stay before he understood what staying meant. And now he knew what it meant. And he was still here, still at this table, still reading a language that wasn't his, learning the shape of a culture that hadn't asked him to care about it, but had become his anyway, in the way that things became yours when you showed up for them consistently enough. Still, he picked up the Velrani text, found his place, kept reading. Outside the viewport, the stars moved the way they always did. And somewhere on level 7, a small Velrani girl was probably not sleeping. Probably sitting near the facility door, counting the corridor numbers, knowing which direction was level 6 waiting for day 60. 9 days. Kyle Marin, who had spent 5 years traveling as light as possible, sat in a diplomat's kitchen at 3 in the morning and found to his considerable surprise that he knew exactly what he was going to say tomorrow and the day after and the day after that, and that he'd been preparing for it without knowing he was preparing for months. Part 3, what staying looks like. Day 59, 1 day before the tribunal. KL couldn't sleep, which wasn't unusual, but tonight the not sleeping had a different quality than it usually did. Not the familiar blank hum of a mind that had simply forgotten how to stop. Something sharper, more present. A mind that knew exactly what was coming and was refusing to be anywhere except fully aware of it. He sat in the chair by his viewport, not the floor, the chair, because some things had shifted in the past 2 months quietly and without announcement, and one of them was that he no longer needed the floor to think. The floor had been for getting low enough that the world couldn't reach him. The chair was for looking out at it directly. He looked out at the stars, the same stars he'd been looking at for 4 years from his lab, except they looked different from here. From a room that had Saya's borrowed data pads stacked on the corner table, and a Velrani text dog-eared to the chapter on guardian rights, and ocean depth maps with edges gone soft from being handled too many times by small focused fingers. He thought about 2 soldiers. He thought about a night 5 years ago when the order had come through clear, and the situation had been straightforward, and he had looked at the men who couldn't walk and made a decision that he'd been carrying ever since. Not because it was wrong, he still didn't know if it was wrong, but because it had weight, because choices have weight. And the weight doesn't go away just because you were right, or because you were wrong, or because the years pass and the situation recedes into the language of formal reports. Sometimes the weight is exactly the same regardless of whether you made the right call or not. That was the part no one told you. He thought about Saya on level 7, 9 days in that facility. 9 mornings he'd stood in the corridor outside the secured viewport, pressed his hand against the exterior of the glass, watched her press hers against the interior. Twice she'd been awake when he arrived. She'd smiled both times. Because she was 7. Because she had decided her guardian was outside the window, and that constituted presence, and presence was what she needed. He didn't deserve that. He was going to try to deserve it anyway. His communicator lit up. 1:14 station time. Solon. He picked up. "You're not sleeping either," he said. "No." Her voice was quiet. The version that came out after midnight. The one without the professional register, without the careful calibration of a diplomat choosing words for their effect. He'd started to recognize it as the real one, or at least one of the real ones. "I keep running the numbers." "Stop running the numbers." "I can't." "Solon." He leaned back in the chair. "What's the worst version?" A pause, longer than her usual pauses. "Orin wins," she said. "The bond is dissolved." "Saya," she stopped, rerouted. "Saya loses something she won't be able to name for years. She'll have the loss before she has the language for it. And I go to Earth without another stop." The word she didn't say occupied the space where it would have been. Without. The silence stretched. "Without the family we've been building," she said finally, very quiet, like she'd made a decision to be honest and was slightly surprised by the specific shape the honesty took when it came out. Kale held the communicator. Thought about that word, family. The same word that had startled him months ago the first time Saya used it, said it the way she said everything, as a simple statement of observable fact rather than a significant declaration. The word that had seemed enormous and presumptuous, and underneath both of those true. It had always been true. He'd just been getting used to the size of it. "That's not going to happen," he said. "You don't know." "No, I don't know." He kept his voice steady and meant it. "But I know what I'm going to say tomorrow. And I know it's true. And true things in my experience tend to hold up under examination better than things that are just strategically constructed." Another silence, longer and different in quality. "I'm scared," she said. He understood exactly what it cost her to say that. This woman who had raised a child alone for 4 years, who had navigated diplomatic corridors and political systems, in the particular loneliness of being very competent in a world that mostly just needed you to be useful. This woman who crossed her arms to hold herself together rather than to keep people out. "I know," he said. "Is that all you're going to say?" "I was also going to say that I'm scared too." A beat. "And that scared is different from unprepared." A soft sound from her end. Not quite a laugh, something warmer and more specific. "Go to sleep, Kale. You first. That's not how it works. I'll try if you try." A pause. "Okay," she said. He didn't sleep, but he stayed in the chair until the not sleeping was quieter, until it was less a roar and more a hum. Until day 60 began to arrive at the edges of the viewport, the station's artificial dawn cycling up through gray to pale gold. He put on his jacket and went to tell the truth. The Tribune of Cultural Integrity met in a formal chamber on level 6. Kyle had been in courtrooms before. Military review boards, inquiry panels, rooms designed specifically to make you feel the weight of the institutional scrutiny, to communicate through architecture and arrangement that what happened here mattered and would be recorded and would follow you. He knew how to stand in those rooms. Feet apart, hands still, eyes forward. The posture that said, "I have survived worse rooms than this, and I know it, and the room knows it." This room was different in ways he hadn't anticipated. Velrani formal design, deep blue walls, the kind of blue that was present rather than decorative. Geometric lighting that came from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, no visible sources, just illumination that existed. 7 seats arranged in a curved formation, the curve designed so that all 7 judges could observe the person at the center from slightly different angles. Deliberate. You were never entirely sure where to look. Everyone was always looking at you. Oren sat at the center. He was older than Kale had expected from his public record. 60 or beyond, silver gray in the Velrani way that age expressed itself. His skin had deepened to the darker blue that came with decades. His ears were creased at the edges, He sat with the particular stillness of someone for whom authority was so deeply habituated, it no longer required any performance. It was simply how he existed in a room. He looked at Kale when Kale entered, not with hostility, not with contempt or satisfaction or any of the simpler emotions. With assessment, the way you looked at something you'd been told to evaluate and were now evaluating. Exactly the way Kale was looking at him. Two people taking accurate stock of each other. Solon sat in the gallery. Her formal role in the proceedings required presence without participation, which Kale understood was one of the more refined elements of Oren's procedural strategy. She was there to see everything and say nothing, to watch without being able to affect, to sit with her diplomat's composure perfectly assembled, while the person she'd invited into her daughter's life stood in the center of a formal chamber and tried to hold on to something they were both trying to hold on to. She looked at him when he walked to the center position. He gave her the smallest nod. She gave him nothing back because she was a diplomat and the gallery had eyes. But her ears moved, just slightly, forward. He was beginning to think he spoke ear. Oren opened. His argument was precise, well-constructed, thorough in the way that arguments were thorough when they'd been built by someone who had been building this kind of argument for 20 years and knew exactly where they were going before they started. He laid out the cultural framework first, the history of guardian bonds in Velrani practice, the specific requirements that had developed over centuries of legal and ethical development, the reasons those requirements existed, then the criteria against which this specific bond was to be assessed, then methodically where this bond fell short of those criteria. Cross-species guardian claims he argued required exceptional proof of cultural comprehension, not intent, not affection, not goodwill, which he was careful to acknowledge was clearly present. Comprehension. The guardian must demonstrate not just willingness to learn Velrani culture, but actual understanding of what the bond meant in Velrani terms, and the cultural foundation to honor that meaning across the full duration of the child's development. Coming-of-age ceremonies, educational decisions, medical choices, cultural formation. A bond wasn't a single moment. It was a commitment measured in decades. Could a human provide that? He asked it quietly, without theater. A human who had grown up without any knowledge of guardian bond traditions, who had encountered the bond through a single emergency response in a corridor, who had no Velrani family, no cultural immersion, no formal training, who, however genuinely he might try, could not fully understand what he had committed to from the inside. He didn't answer his own question. He didn't need to. The question contained the answer. Then he presented Kale's file. He didn't dramatize it. The absence of dramatization was what made it effective. He simply laid it out. The record, the night, the decision and its consequences, the formal finding, the discharge. This is not character assassination, he said with the tone of someone who had considered carefully whether it was and concluded it wasn't. This is pattern recognition. Dr. Marin has demonstrated under significant pressure a tendency to make unilateral decisions that prioritize immediate emotional response over strategic judgment. In a guardian relationship spanning decades encompassing medical decisions, educational guidance, cultural formation at every stage of development, this documented pattern is relevant to the question before this tribunal. He sat down. 7 faces looked at Kale. Kale stood up. He didn't have a prepared statement. Solon had offered to help him write one, and he declined not out of stubbornness, but because every version he'd tried to write sounded like something other than what he actually wanted to say. Every version had been a defense, and he didn't want to defend himself. He wanted to tell the truth. "I'm going to tell you about a night," he said. The room was very quiet in the way that formal rooms were quiet when they were actually listening. 5 years ago, a unit I was serving with received an extraction order in deteriorating conditions. The order was clear: move out, maintain position security, leave behind soldiers who could not be moved safely. He kept his voice even, not flat, just honest in the way that stripped away performance and left only what was actually there. I looked at those men and I couldn't follow that order. Not because I didn't understand it. I understood it completely. The strategic logic was sound, but I understood also just as completely that I couldn't walk away from people who needed me and come back and still be the person I needed to be. Those two things were both true. I couldn't resolve them in the direction the order required. A pause. I stayed. The unit's position was compromised. Two people died. He let that sit in the room, didn't contextualize it, didn't soften it, didn't explain away the weight of it. Just let it be in the room at its actual weight because that was the only honest way to say it. I've carried that for 5 years. I'll carry it for the rest of my life. Director Oren is correct that I made a unilateral decision. He is correct that it had consequences I couldn't control. He looked at Oren directly. What he's asking you to conclude from that is that I'm not trustworthy with difficult decisions. What I'm asking you to see is something different. He looked at the 7 faces. At the 4th judge, a woman younger than the others who had stopped writing somewhere during Oren's presentation and hadn't started again. 5 months ago, an alarm went off on this station, a routine depressurization. I was in my lab. I should have gone straight to the shelter. That was the protocol, and I knew it. Instead, I rounded a corner and found a child alone in a corridor, frightened in the specific way that children are frightened when they've decided no one is coming for them. He didn't perform this. He just said it. I sat down on the floor. I stayed with her until her mother arrived. Then I went to the shelter. A pause. Director Oren calls that an emotional response. He's right. It was. But I would suggest to this tribunal that the question isn't whether the response was emotional. The question is whether the response was correct. The 4th judge had set her stylus down entirely. I have spent 5 months with sci-fi. I have answered questions about ocean depth and the evolutionary rationale for human hair, and why the Pacific Ocean is unreasonably large, which is a completely legitimate observation, and she's right to make it. I have been present for her school presentations. I have learned to read a cultural text in a language that is not mine because her mother suggested it, and I wanted to understand, not perform understanding. I have stood outside a facility window for 9 days and pressed my hand against the glass because that was the only way I could tell her I was still there. He stopped. I'm not asking you to approve of me. His voice was quiet, but it carried. I understand that I'm an unusual candidate for this bond. I understand that I lack cultural education. I understand that my record is complicated, and that complicated records make institutions cautious, as they should. A beat. But I know what it means to stay. I know what it costs to stay when staying is hard. And I know why it's worth it. And Saya knows. That's why she's been asking for me. Not because I'm perfect, not because I have credentials, because I stayed. And she knew from the floor of a corridor during an emergency alarm that staying was what I did. He sat down. The room was quiet. Oren rose for his response. He was measured. He made 3 points, each one careful and well-reasoned, each one addressed to specific aspects of what Cale had said. Cale could feel the tribunal's attention redistributing, weighing, assessing the specific gravity of what they'd heard against what they knew about institutional standards and cultural precedent. The 4th judge picked up her stylus, but she wasn't writing. She was watching Cale. And then Oren said, "The child in question has been in a certified cultural residence facility for 9 days. By all accounts, she has adjusted appropriately to the environment. This suggests that while the bond is real and meaningful, it may not be as constitutive of her daily functioning." The door opened, not loudly, not dramatically. A small sound, a latch releasing, a hinge turning. Every head in the chamber turned. In the doorway of this tribune of cultural integrity stood Saya Vael, 7 years old. In her facility clothes, simple and pale, clearly what she'd been wearing when she made her decision and went. Her ears were all the way up. Her eyes found Cale across the formal chamber with the precision of someone who had been told exactly where he would be and had navigated there directly. She was breathing hard. She'd walk fast, maybe run. 3 corridors from level 7 to level 6, alone. Having explained to Nurse Adrian that she needed to go and then gone before the explanation could be contested. The chamber was absolutely still. One of the tribunal staff moved toward her. Instinct. Protocol. Children did not belong in formal tribunal proceedings. Oren raised his hand. Not to welcome her, to stop the staff member. Because Oren knew. Every Velrani in the room knew in the way that cultural knowledge was bone deep rather than learned what it meant when a child sought their guardian during a bond tribunal. Not an arranged entrance, not a coached moment. A child who had decided on her own with no consultation and no permission that she needed to be somewhere. And gone there. This was the bond. Not the arguments, not the documents, not the precedents. This, a 7-year-old who crossed 3 corridors alone because her guardian was in a room and she needed to be in it too. Saya walked into the formal chamber of the Tribune of Cultural Integrity. She walked to Kale. She stood beside him, her small hand finding his with the ease of something that had found its place. And she looked at the 7 judges with the calm certainty of someone who had arrived precisely where she was supposed to be and had no uncertainty about it whatsoever. She didn't perform. She didn't speak. She just stood there, with him. The silence lasted a long time. Oren sat very still at the center of the curve. The 4th judge's stylus was on the table. The presiding judge, an older man whose deep creased ears spoke of decades in formal chambers, looked at Saya. Then at Kale. Then at their joined hands. He said something in Velrani that Kale's translator rendered as the child has spoken. What happened next was procedural. It always was in the end. The emotional weight gathered to its peak, and then the machinery of formal process took over, moving at its own measured pace, and you had to let it move rather than try to hurry it. The tribunal recessed. 40 minutes. Kael sat in a waiting area with Saya beside him. She leaned against his arm with the ease of someone returning to a familiar position and asked if he'd eaten because she'd had breakfast at the facility, and it was actually quite good. And she thought he probably hadn't had anything, and that seemed like a problem worth addressing. I'm fine. You're lying. You're very perceptive. I know. Solon was allowed to join them. She came in quickly and knelt in front of Saya and checked her over with the focused attention of a mother, making certain that the small person in front of her was physically intact. Then she looked up at Kale with an expression that was doing several different things simultaneously and wasn't trying to hide any of them. 3 corridors, she said. I know. On her own. I know, Saya said patiently. I knew where he was. They said the big blue room on level 6. And level 6 is that way. And I know how to read the corridor numbers. You left without telling anyone. I told Nurse Adren. I said I was going to the tribunal to be with my guardian. She said you couldn't. She did. I explained that I needed to. She was still explaining when I left. Saya considered this. I think she understood eventually. Solon closed her eyes for a brief moment. We're going to discuss this, she said. Yes, Mama. At considerable length. Yes, Mama. But not today. Saya leaned back against Kale's arm with the settling quality of someone returning to exactly where they needed to be. I know, she said. Today we're waiting. The tribunal returned in 41 minutes. Kale stood. The presiding judge spoke in standard, a formal acknowledgement that a human was present and deserved to understand the proceedings without depending on translation lag. The petition, he said, was denied. The guardian's mark between Saya Vael and Dr. Kale Marin was recognized as culturally valid. The bond would be formally registered in Velrani diplomatic records. Dr. Marin's status as guardian was affirmed. 6 of the 7 judges had voted to deny the petition. The presiding judge noted for the formal record that the tribunal had taken into account not only the testimonies presented, but the demonstration of the bond's authenticity that had occurred during the proceedings themselves. He looked at Saya when he said it. He did not smile. This was a formal chamber, and he had a reputation that formal chambers required. But something happened at the corners of his eyes that wasn't entirely professional. Kale felt Saya's hand tighten in his. He looked at Solon. She was very still, her composure completely in place. Every diplomatic line of her exactly where it was supposed to be. Except her eyes. He'd learned to read her eyes. They found Oren in the corridor outside the chamber. Not by design. He was simply leaving at the same time they were. The corridor was not large enough for 2 parties to pretend not to see each other, not at this proximity, not after what had just occurred in the room they'd all just left. He stopped when he saw them. Kale stopped. Saya was between them holding Kale's hand, looking at Oren with the clear and uncomplicated assessment of a child who had not yet learned to manage social awkwardness by pretending it wasn't there. Oren looked at her. His face went through something, not a single expression, a sequence of them. The expression of a man seeing something he had tried to prevent and understanding, perhaps for the first time in the process of this tribunal, why the prevention had been wrong. Not legally, not procedurally, actually wrong. He looked at Kale. Dr. Marin, formal, neutral in its surface. But what moved underneath the neutral was neither of those things. Director Oren, a pause that had weight. Your record, Oren said. The night in question. Another pause. My review of it was not incorrect, but it was incomplete. Kale waited. I have a son, Oren said. He was 8 years old when he stopped. The sentence required more than he'd prepared for. Started again from a different approach. When the medical station turned him away, and I spent the year afterward looking for someone to hold responsible. For his ears flattened slightly by a degree that was barely visible, but that Kale could now read for the fact that the system failed him. Failed him in ways that a system is supposed to prevent. I know, Kale said. Oren looked at him with something that might have been surprise. Darrow Kelsch, my colleague. He found the financial documents. Kale kept his voice level. No accusation in it, just information. I know about the contract, about the timing of the petition relative to Solon's appointment. A long silence. I won't pretend, Oren said slowly, measuring each word before committing to it, that those things were entirely separate in my mind. They may not have been. He looked at Saya again, at the small person standing in the corridor holding her guardian's hand. But I also won't pretend that my concern for cultural integrity was entirely without basis. I know that too, Kale said. Oren looked back at him. There was something in his face that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who had expected anger and received something else. You've been angry at a system, Kale said, and your son was inside it and it failed him in a way that left a mark. That's real. I don't have any argument with that being real. A beat. But I'm not the system, and she's not a policy. He looked down at Saya, who was watching this exchange with the focused attention of a child cataloging important information about how adults handle difficult things. She's just a kid who sat on a floor with me and decided to trust me. That's the whole of it. Oren was quiet for a long time. Then he looked at Saya, really looked at her, not as a case, not as a precedent, not as an embodiment of something he'd been trying to argue about for the past 2 months. As a small person standing in a corridor, holding her guardian's hand, looking back at him with clear amber eyes. He said her name, quietly. Just her name in Velrani, the way you address someone directly when you wanted them to know you saw them specifically, not categorically. Then he said one word, soft. Rael. Just that, his son's name. Offered into the space between them like something he'd been holding for a long time. Saya looked up at Kaio. He nodded. She looked back at Oren and said simply with the complete sincerity of a 7-year-old who didn't know how to be anything except what she meant, thank you. Oren walked away. The walk of a man carrying something heavy who might possibly be somewhere in the process of setting it down. Kale didn't know. Some things didn't resolve in corridors. Some things took years in quieter rooms than this. He hoped distantly that the man found something on the other side of this, that the grief found somewhere to go that wasn't outward. Then Saya tugged his hand. Can we eat now? I'm very hungry. Also, I want to tell you about the facility's plant collection because they have specimens I've never seen before, and at least one of them might be from the Kareth system, which I've been reading about, and I need your xenobiology expertise to verify. Your expertise is on the plant, Kale said. Your expertise is on the system. Mine is on the plant. We combine them. The result is comprehensive. That's actually a reasonable scientific approach. I know I designed it. She was already moving, pulling him gently down the corridor in the direction of the food district with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she was going. Mama, too. Mama knows the diplomatic history of the Kareth system, which might be relevant to the specimen provenance. Solon fell into step beside him. He glanced at her. She glanced at him. Neither of them said anything because Saya was talking, and Saya had been in a facility for 9 days and had earned every inch of the silence she was filling, and then some. And because some things didn't need to be said yet, they could be said later in the quiet when there was time and space for them. They walked, the three of them, down the corridor of Aelith Cross Station Level 6, heading toward food and plant specimens, and the diplomatic history of a system that might be relevant, and the specific ongoing conversation that happened between people who had become something to each other without quite deciding to which was perhaps the only way that kind of becoming ever really worked. 2 weeks later, Solon accepted the appointment. Earth, the diplomatic post, 3 years minimum with extension probable, given the scope of the assignment. She told Kale over tea in the quiet of her quarters with Saya asleep in the next room. She said it the way she said difficult things directly, and without preamble, watching his face for the response she wasn't sure how to ask for. He said, "I know." She stopped. "You know. You." Darrow mentioned the official announcement was coming. "I've been thinking about it." He set down his cup. "I've been talking to the xenobiology faculty at the Terran Research Institute. They've been trying to recruit someone with my specific background for 2 years. Deep space biological adaptation studies with cross-species methodology." Solon went very still. "I said yes last week," he said. A pause. "You." She stopped. "You already arranged it. I didn't want to tell you before the tribunal. Too many variables, and I didn't want it to be a factor in any of the decisions being made." He looked at her. "And I didn't want you to feel like you were the reason or that you owed me something because of a decision I'd already made. And now the tribunal is done, and you're going, and I'd like to go too." A pause. "If that's yes," she said, clear, immediate, not a considered diplomatic response, a simple yes. He looked at her. She looked at him. "Yes," she said again, quieter. "That's yes." From the next room, a small voice. "Are you talking about Earth?" They both turned toward the doorway, where Saya had appeared wearing the expression of someone who had been awake for the entire conversation and felt no philosophical difficulty about that. "Possibly," Solon said. "Are we all going?" "Possibly," Kale said. Saya considered this with the gravity she brought to important information. Then she walked over and sat down between them with the decisive comfort of someone who had identified the correct position and taken it. "The Pacific Ocean is unreasonably large," she said, "but I would like to see it. You've mentioned that several times. It continues to merit mentioning. You can't confirm a hypothesis from photographs." She leaned against his arm the way she always did, without asking, without needing to, as if it were simply the natural order of things that had been true before either of them had quite noticed. "Will it be strange," she said, "living on a planet just probably," Kale said. "Planets are strange, even Earth, especially Earth." She nodded, satisfied. "But we'll figure it out," she said. Not a question, a conclusion. "Yeah," he said, "we will." Solon reached over. Not dramatically, not with announcement, just reached over and placed her hand over his where it rested on the table. Her skin silver white in the viewport light, carrying that faint trace of violet in her hair. His warmer, less certain, more accustomed to holding things alone. He turned his hand over. A quiet agreement. The kind that didn't need ceremony to be real. Saya pretended not to notice very convincingly by immediately beginning to describe the geological composition of Earth's western coastal cliffs in substantial detail, which she had been researching and found significant because the layered sediment was essentially a record of time, and every layer was a year, and every year was readable, if you knew the language which she was currently learning. They let her talk. The transport left on a Saturday. Kael's luggage was manageable. 3 bags, lab equipment carefully packed, research materials, a Velrani text on cultural bonding practices he'd been working through for months, dog-eared to the chapter on guardian rights, and then to several chapters beyond it. The ocean depth map Saya had studied until the edges were soft with handling. Darrow came to the transport bay. They stood in the particular silence of people who had worked beside each other long enough that goodbye required very few words and carried a great many more inside them. You're going to come back with opinions about Earth plans, Darrow said. Specific ones. You'll want to tell me about them. You'll want to hear them. I'll pretend I don't, for about 30 seconds. Kale picked up his bag. Thank you, he said, for the documents, for the coffees, for 4 years of not making me explain myself. He stopped. The sentence had more in it than he could get out in the transport bay with the clock running. For finding the thread. I know, Darrow said. Simply. The way Darrow said things, he meant entirely. They shook hands. Then something more than a handshake, because 4 years of shared lab silence, and 2 coffees every morning, and 1 thread pulled at 2 in the morning because it needed to be pulled, was not reducible to a handshake, and they both knew it. Darrow stepped back, nodded once. Kale walked toward the transport. Solon was at the gate, speaking quietly with a diplomatic colleague managing the final details of a departure, the way she managed everything with complete attention and no visible effort. She looked up when he approached. Something in her expression shifted barely perceptibly and unmistakably. Saya was sitting on her luggage studying a data pad showing Earth's western coastline. The cliffs here, she said without looking up, finger on the screen, are compressed sediment. The rock is a record. Every layer is a year. Every year is readable if you learn the language. She looked up. We should go see them. We probably should. I've made a list. She held up the data pad. Organized by geological significance and by proximity to ocean, because I want to see the ocean first. The size requires in-person confirmation. Of course it does. Scientific rigor, Kale. Solon joined them. The gate opens in 10 minutes. Saya slid off her luggage, took one of Kale's hands without being asked, then took one of Solon's. Standing between them, looking at the transport gate with the calm of someone who had been expecting this particular development for some time and was pleased to see it arrive on schedule. Are you scared? She asked. She was looking at him. A little, he said. She nodded seriously. Me too. A beat. But guardians don't run from scared things. That's what you taught me. He looked at this child, who had sat on a floor with him and decided to trust him before she knew his name, who had walked 3 corridors alone across a space station to stand beside him when it mattered, because standing beside people was what you did when they were yours and you were theirs. Yeah, he said. I did teach you that. So, she looked at the gate. We're going. We're going, Solon confirmed. Saya tightened her grip on both their hands, and they walked through the gate together. The transport lifted clear of Aelith Cross at 0917 station time. Kale sat by the viewport. Saya was asleep almost immediately, her head on his arm. The datapad of Earth coastline still lit in her lap, the list of things to see still open, organized by geological significance and ocean proximity. Item 1, the Pacific. Confirmed unreasonably large. Must verify in person. Solon was across the aisle, reading, her silver-white hair catching the viewport light, that faint trace of violet visible when the angle was right. Her ears at the fully relaxed angle he'd learned meant she was actually calm, not performing it. The difference between the two was something he'd learned to read over 5 months of paying attention. He looked out at the station receding. 12 levels, 43 species. The lab where he'd spent 19-hour days in productive solitude, telling himself it was enough. He didn't miss it. He missed Darrow. He'd missed the centrifuge that ran at exactly the right speed every single time. He'd missed maybe the specific quality of silence that a space station had at 3 in the morning when he was the only one awake. The sound of life support, breathing the rhythm of boot on metal that was not unlike a heartbeat and was more reliable. But he didn't miss his life there, because his life wasn't there anymore. He looked at Saya sleeping, at the ocean depth maps she'd studied until the edges went soft, at the hand she'd put in his without being asked that first night on the floor of her mother's quarters in the tribunal chamber at the gate just now. The hand that found his every time, like it already knew where to go, like it had always known. He thought about staying, about how it had seemed obvious every time the question arose. Corridor 9C, the floor of the diplomatic quarters. The corridor window on level 7, his hand against the cold glass. The tribunal chamber when a small person walked through the door and found him across a formal room. Every time the question had been whether to stay, every time the answer had been the same. Simple, even when it wasn't easy. And simple and easy were not the same thing, had never been the same thing. Staying was the simplest thing he'd ever done, and also the hardest, and the difficulty didn't make it wrong. It just made it real. The choices that cost something were the ones that meant something, not as a consolation, as a fact. He had thought for a long time that the cost was a warning, a signal of error, a reason to pull back to protect himself from the weight of caring about things that could be taken away. But the cost was the point. You stayed because it mattered, and it mattered because it cost you something to stay. Those two things weren't in tension. They were the same thing seen from different angles. He looked out at the stars. Solon glanced over from across the aisle, found him looking at her, didn't look away. "You're thinking," she said. "Occupational hazard. What about—" He looked at Saya. At the coastline she intended to confirm in person. At the ocean that was unreasonably large and deserved to be verified. At the hand still loosely holding his sleeve even in sleep, as if she'd decided his arm was a fixed point and arranged herself around it accordingly. "About staying," he said. Solon was quiet for a moment. And it's the easiest hard thing I've ever done." She looked at him. Her amber eyes the same amber as her daughter's. The family resemblance that ran all the way through the same eyes that had stood outside his quarters 8 months ago and assessed him in the corridor light and decided to knock on the door of a stranger at midnight because her daughter needed something and she was going to get it. The color of something he hadn't had a word for yet. He had time. "Yes," she said, simply, just that. Outside the viewport, the stars moved the way they always did. Patient, constant, present, whether observed or not, whether shared or not, whether you had someone beside you or not, but different somehow when observed alongside another person. Not in the stars themselves, in the observing. Saya shifted in her sleep, murmured something about sediment layers, about the record of time written in stone, about how every year was readable if you learned the language, which she was currently learning, which would take some time, but she had time. Kyle Marin, who had spent 5 years getting very good at traveling light, who had built a life around the principle that distance was safer than proximity, who had sat down on a cold metal floor one ordinary afternoon because a child was crying and leaving, had seemed in that moment simply impossible. Sat with his hand warm under a sleeping child and his eyes on a woman who had read the worst of him and knocked on his door anyway, and felt with a clarity that didn't require examination or qualification that he was exactly where the accumulated weight of his choices had been carrying him all along. Not to a place, to a direction, one he'd been walking toward without knowing it, and he was finally there.